I'm curious about how you guys got introduced to the Discovery Communication and a bit about what you're experiencing thus far, because I know you've had that exposure and you've had some practice. Tell us a little bit about what's been the value for you, and it's more than a promo, because I want us to actually, if we can come up with some specific scenarios, situations where you've saw that when you've led with your ears and practiced some of these skills, using some of these things, how God showed up and something special happened. I'm not asking for much, but what are you hearing my question to be?
Well, I think we were introduced to it because we were leading a leadership initiative, and one of the members came to us with the idea. And like all things, when they mention a book, when they mention materials, we were like, okay, But this individual was very persistent. It felt like there was something there that could really enhance the ability, particularly of us coaching the individuals going through the program.
Yes.
And that was intriguing. We knew that we had to upgrade and really change the way we had been coaching, because up to that point it was more of what I call more of a static type of thing. There was coaching, there was mentoring, but my experience had been that it was like kind of pulling teeth. That there was oftentimes appointments where not a lot seemingly was accomplished, and the whole premise of this coaching was that we wanted the coachee, that we called them, to really take the initiative with us on the agenda. And so if that was the case, then we were going to have to listen well and kind of process through these things with them. And so the tool for Can I Hear You Now? It was invaluable. I think it became a centerpiece for all that we were trying to do, because coaching was really at the center of what we were trying to do.
So I want to ask a question, but I want to summarize you first, then I'll ask a question. So what you're saying is, again, you were introduced to it as to help you guys address something that you've already identified you wanted to do, and that is to be more effective in equipping leadership and coaching as one of their functions. And yet what you had been using and the way you'd been approaching it seemed to be way too static, and I'm going to supply the word, the absence of dynamism, or the dynamic was not there, the dynamic process. And that since it was brought to you, you began to look at it, got some experience with it. And that's been how long ago that this whole routine started?
I would say roughly a year to 18 months.
Okay.
Yeah. So relatively soon.
Yeah. How's it been for you, Jeanette, in terms of this? Is it been most useful in your ministry? Has it been useful in your other relationships? Has it been interested in your home and your family?
Well, I think having been a social work major and just my personality tends to be more of a wanting people to share and hearing what they're saying. So for me, I think it really was most helpful for our youngest child. He's quieter than the rest of our kids. I'm an extrovert, and we have 5 children, and they are all introverts, and my husband's an introvert. But our youngest child is just not a real talker about things, and I realized by going through the material that I was not asking the questions properly. It reminded me that I needed to not just ask, because his tendency was to answer yes or no.
Yes.
So I had to become very creative, because my other children, I could ask the same question and they would elaborate, but he just didn't. And it wasn't that he didn't want to share, it just is kind of his communication style. So for me, it was helpful to try to figure out, okay, how can I make this conversation go longer so I'm just not getting a yes-no answer.
Yes. And how did it work? What did you do differently? How did it apply? How was your...
For me personally, I had to start thinking in my mind instead of just throwing out a question to him. So it took time for me to process, like, how can I ask this question to get more than a yes-no answer? And it sometimes took a lot of time to figure that out. And I would still say he would try to say as little as possible. But it helped me, I guess, become a better listener and a better question asker.
Okay. So you're recognizing that you had to really put extra effort and energy into it because it was a situation different than what had been so with the other children.
Yes, very
And
much.
so it called for some extra effort, but yet you found yourself being able to supply that.
Yes.
And that was a huge benefit to you. Okay.
And I would say it's something I have to keep constantly thinking about in my communication with
Right.
him.
You know, taking it away from him, and as you've labeled yourself an extrovert, it's sometimes I'm just generalizing. I'm not talking about you as an individual, but I think sometimes the extroverts who are vocal in their thinking out loud about whatever do not necessarily know what's being heard, and sometimes they've never been given an option as to what or how to check out. And so there's a tendency to overstate or repeatedly state whatever by the extrovert, and those not so inclined to, I want to almost say compete with that, get overwhelmed.
Correct.
What are you hearing me say about my observation about extroverts?
Well, I'm hearing you say that extroverts tend to be pretty vocal and communicating, and sometimes they're not really listening because they're trying to get their points out and across.
Right. But they still don't know what's been heard because most of them have never been encouraged or challenged or even seen the model of.
Right.
What are you hearing? And I know I'm not an extrovert by my wiring. So then, since they're not sure what's being said, they get more vocal. They get more hyped.
Right.
And then actually the wall begins to get larger, and then it really gets anxious for everybody. That's a normal course of things, and yet I see how God can actually prompt us by either being an introvert and asking, let me see if I've got what you said, which is a real risk for them
Yes.
to vocalize as a category. I'm not saying that's true of your husband who's labeled himself that way, that Kevin would be that way, but it's a very natural because I'm by nature very introverted.
Right.
I'm not a people person, and yet I'm engaged in people lives for 46
Right.
years. And yet it's an act of God for me to actually listen. When you look at my profiles, I'm needs repeatedly. I can produce in my briefcase right now 4 different profiles done by me over 2005, 2009, 2011, 2012, whereas identifying this guy who took this profile really needs help when it comes to listening.
Right.
So I'm engaged in this because I need it. It's not because it's a natural for me. It really is a God thing for me to actually learn how to be resting in his identity and being intentional of capturing what other people are saying.
Right.
What are you hearing me say about myself and my journey?
Well,
Maybe I need to give your husband a chance.
yes.
On this one.
Well, what's interesting, even though you're an introvert and you tend to be more quiet,
Yes.
you're finding that even your own journey has been, it's not an easy thing to do.
Yes.
To be engaged in hearing what someone is being said.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because on my journey, I have always, and even in a fleshly way, I think, prided myself in the fact that I listen really well.
Oh, yes.
And people have said, oh, you're a good listener.
Yes.
But I have to be honest, up to this point, I don't think I was an aggressive listener.
Right.
I was a very passive listener. And whether or not the other person sensed anything, there would be times my mind would be drifting away. And if they had stopped and said, well, what did you hear me say?
Right.
I wouldn't be able to repeat it.
Right on. Right on.
So I think the tool that we're talking about, just a couple things that we can implement in a conversation, is really invaluable. And if someone already has the patience to listen,
Right.
it'll totally enhance
Yes.
their ability to help that person really feel heard
Right.
at the end.
Yeah, you're putting into words. But I could let you practice your skills of summarizing what he said. What did you just hear your husband say?
That he has always been considered a good listener, and he thought himself a good listener. But until he did this course, the book, he saw that he wasn't always an aggressive, active listener. That sometimes his mind would drift, and he wouldn't be able to communicate back what the person was saying to him.
Yeah. Did you get it?
Yes. Yes, very well.
Go ahead.